Alright, back to talking about Avatar The Last Airbender today. I know this is going to make some of you guys really happy. Some of you guys have really been looking forward to these reviews. Which means I'm probably going to up the frequency of them a little bit, because I like to make you guys happy. We'll see. We'll see what happens. My hat looks funny today. Does it look funny to you guys? Let me know in the comments and I'll adjust it. That'd be a trick one. Anyway, we're talking about the Southern Air Temple today, which I want to say right out the gate, I like that we go from the Southern Pole, or like the Southern Polar region at least, to the Southern Air Temple. It gives a real sense of progression in the characters' journeys and also the geography of this world very, very quickly in just the third episode of the show. Here we have these two southern locations. We know that they aren't in the same place, that they are a distance away from each other, and we don't know how fast Appa can fly, obviously, but we get a sense that these areas are relatively close together. After all, the kids are going on a journey to the North Pole, the absolute opposite side of the planet, and this isn't one of Aang's run off and ride a fish side quests that he gets himself involved in later on, or a stop for supplies. This is a thing that they were able to do because it was on the way. And because Aang felt like he needed to, right? The plot of this one is that Aang is in denial of the fact that the airbenders are gone. Extinct. At least aside from him. He insists that you need a flying bison to get to an air temple, so the Fire Nation probably couldn't have made it to one anyway. And even if it seemed like they were going to, the airbenders probably just would have escaped. So even if there aren't any airbenders at the Southern Air Temple anymore, because that's the Air Temple specifically where Aang grew up, which will come into play in a later episode too. So if there aren't any of them there anymore right now, that could just mean that they're somewhere else. That they moved somewhere else. They're the air nomads. After all, like I say, Aang grew up at the Southern Air Temple, but that's not even entirely true. That was kind of his home base. Aang grew up all over the place. But it is also worth noting that while we know that Aang visited a lot of different places, we only really get specific mentions of places that he's visited when he's further south like this, early on in the story. Or at the very least, as the show progresses and they get further north and then spread out further and further from this rough southern region, specific mentions of specific places, of them revisiting specific places that Aang has been, decrease. Which means that even if he did go all around and visit all kinds of different places, he's still kept to kind of this same area. At least seemingly most of the time. It's just, it's set up for world building that we aren't going to get explicitly ever, and that we aren't going to get at all for dozens of episodes. They never really spell it out to us, but this world is thought out to the point that you can infer it just from background dialogue, and some of the best delivered exposition that I've ever seen in any TV show, let alone a kids show. Because while Aang and Katara and Sokka, and Appa as well, by default, are exploring the temple, and Katara and Sokka are continuing their pseudo-parental role in Aang's new life, with Katara being the more stereotypically feminine, caring parent, quote-unquote, with Sokka being the sterner, we have to prepare him for the real world kind of parent, with Katara trying to hide evidence that firebenders were ever there, whereas Sokka just wants to tell Aang and get it over with, because if the firebenders were there, that means it's far more likely that the monks were attacked and killed off, and there's even evidence that actually happened. Right? There's scattered evidence of both things, but Katara continues to hide them from Aang. And Sokka goes along with it. He wants to make Aang feel better so that he doesn't fall into depression over this. Kind of wants to ease him into it, help him come to understand this in a way that's not super rapid and harsh. Though it turns out that's kind of what Aang needed anyway. Anyway, as that's going on, we get more stuff with Zuko. We cut away to Zuko again, which, if there was any doubt left in your mind after the first two episodes that Zuko is not the villain, but a co-protagonist of this show, this episode makes it not as obvious as it'll ever get this season, but this episode does a good job of setting it up too. In fact, while Aang is dealing with emotional baggage in this episode, Zuko's the one that kind of gets stuff done and then sets out on his own sort of quest officially. We learn from his dialogue with Admiral Zhao. He's Commander Zhao at this point still, but Admiral Zhao later, who's played by Lucius Malfoy, by the way, which is just fantastic. The guy does great villains, right? We get dialogue between Admiral Zhao, the real villain of this season, and Zuko, which clearly establishes why Zuko is doing what he's doing. We know now that he is banished, that his father sent him on, I won't say a mission, a fool's errand. He sent him on a fool's errand as punishment because he's just that cruel a guy that simply executing his son wouldn't have been trying enough, wouldn't have been punishment enough. Jailing him wouldn't have either. So he banishes him until he can find the Avatar. Something that isn't expected to be possible. And yet Zuko, and this is really our first sign that Zuko isn't the cynical person that he appears to be on the surface, still genuinely believes that he'll be able to find the Avatar and earn back his father's respect. He says he wants to earn back his honor, but he really just wants his father to love and respect him. That's really what it comes down to. And a big part of Zuko's arc is going to be realizing that he has to respect himself. That that's not something that other people can give you. That yes, respect is nice. Being respected by people is great. But you have to respect yourself first. And let the people who do care about you into your life rather than keeping them at bay in the hopes that your real family will still somehow accept you. I understand why a lot of queer kids relate to Zuko a lot. Because his journey feels a lot like the kind of thing that a lot of people who are LGBT to one degree or another also go through. In fact, we even get some setup for when we finally see exactly what happened to Zuko, which led immediately to his banishment in the form of his Agni Kai with Commander Zhao. And we also get our first indication of just how badass Iroh is. Like, throughout this entire episode, he's going out of his way to try to avoid conflict because I believe that Iroh at this point, I may have said this in the previous video, I don't remember. I believe that Iroh at this point is still so affected by some of his losses and by the transformation that he underwent after he became a good person, because he was not a good person originally. I think he's still so affected by all of that he is trying his very best to keep out of worldly affairs because he doesn't want to be sucked back into the Fire Nation attitude of superiority, that attitude that the Fire Nation seems to have, that they know better than everybody else for everybody else. So he's very inactive, though by the end of this season, that will have at least mostly changed, and then by a little ways into the beginning of next season, it will have changed even more so. And yet we get our first idea of just how badass he is. We see Zhao and Zuko fight relatively evenly in their Agni Kai, and all throughout it we see that Iroh is a pretty good distance away from both of them, and yet when Zhao tries to, metaphorically at least, stab Zuko in the back, attack him from his blind spot in a sneak attack, Iroh is suddenly there and stops the blow. He would have had to move insanely fast to get there, and you don't even realize exactly how fast he would have had to move until you really sit back and think about it. Like this, it's all very good setup. It's all very good setup for stuff that's going to be paid off spectacularly down the line, and the exposition about Zuko's past here, which, while it doesn't go into full detail, is basically what I was talking about when I mentioned how masterful the exposition in this episode is handled. There is some more traditionally delivered exposition, though. Before Aang does find out definitively what happened to the Airbenders, we get some Avatar stuff. We see the kids enter a room in the temple, because there is one temple from each nation that is specifically designated the Avatar's temple. The Southern Air Temple just happens to be the Air Temple that doubles as that. So they enter this room, it's an Avatar room, with statues of all of Aang's past lives, including his most recent past life, the Firebender Roku. And Aang recognizes them, but he recognizes Roku specifically, and this is all leading up to when he will eventually speak to Roku more or less in person, a little ways down the line. But it also tells us very effectively, without using words, again, that this place is special to the line of avatars, so that later on in the episode, when we see Aang enter into the avatar state for the first time, even though we don't know that that's what it's called yet, and technically it's not even the first time. The first time on screen, right? When the statues light up, and then other temples from each of the 3 other kingdoms, the other nations, light up with the same blue light, we understand what that means. That Aang's awakening of his avatar spirit, as Katara puts it in this episode, has reawakened these places. And we actually see in that moment that this has alerted the keepers of the Avatar's temple in the Fire Nation that he is in fact still alive and he is rediscovering his powers. So now Zhao, who also wants the Avatar for glory, and Zuko aren't even the only Fire Nation guys who are going to be looking for the Avatar. Everyone is going to be expecting him to be out there, and everybody's going to want a piece of him if they can get it. This is also where we first learn about Monk Gyatso, the airbending master who trained Aang, more so than anybody else, and his original parental figure. Like, the monks don't technically have parents, but Gyatso was definitely his surrogate father. Aang seems to have, for lack of a better word, inherited his sense of humor from Gyatso, and we actually learn later on in the series that Roku and Gyatso trained in airbending alongside each other. So Gyatso has actually known Aang for 2 lifetimes. I would argue that Gyatso, 100 years ago, was Aang's closest living friend. And he's the one who Aang originally finds dead in the temple, the first airbender that Aang discovers dead in the temple. Like, it chokes me up thinking about it. It's such an emotional scene, and the payoff is great. First of all, technical aspect I want to talk about. We learn later on, as late as... it's not the final season of Korra, it's the second to last season of Korra, that airbending can be used to suck the air out of places or even people. And we know that fire needs air to burn. The fact that Gyatso was killed in an enclosed space, surrounded by Fire Nation soldiers, all of whom were souped up on the power of Sozin's comet, by the way, and yet there are no burns anywhere in the room around them, that suggests that Gyatso was able to evacuate all air from that room, taking all of those soldiers with him, and also preventing them from using their powers against him at the same time. Like, Aang in this episode calls Gyatso the most powerful airbender in the world, and this is coming from someone who learned from him, was trained by him, who is a master in airbending because of the tutelage of this person, and who is demonstrably one of the most powerful airbenders that we ever see in this franchise. And yet Aang thinks that Gyatso is better than him. And I kind of agree, frankly. And it's this shock that forces Aang into the Avatar state, but in a really cool move, Katara is able to bring him out of it. She's able to offer him the emotional support that he needs to come out of that grief and rage-induced, superpowered state, symbolizing that it's the support of our friends and loved ones that gets us through difficult times. Like, this show is all about found family. These people have found each other, and already they seem to feel like family to one another. The Avatar state in general is also the first stop on my road towards proving that energy bending was actually set up through the entire show. Quite literally, because, and this is effectively the thesis of that very long-form essay, the Avatar state is just energy bending. This episode, though, is also an example of a few things about this show, especially early on, that kind of make me cringe a little bit. There are scenes in this episode which look absolutely immaculate. The scene where they're walking through the room full of past Avatar statues is breathtakingly beautiful, and some of the backgrounds are stupendous. But there are some scenes where they're just traveling on Appa, where the animation on the characters looks a little off, and they still hadn't really worked out how to animate the bending scenes. The Agni Kai between Zuko and Zhao looks like butt. I'm sorry, I know some people love it, but especially compared to battle sequences that we're going to be getting just a handful of episodes down the line, it looks really bad. Really basic. The movements are stunted and blocky. The blocking of the scene is incredibly uninteresting. And this is coming from someone who writes action and not particularly well. Like, I know I probably couldn't do much better, but I know these people can do better than this. And so going back and watching it is a little frustrating. There's also an example of an aspect of this show's humor that I don't particularly like here in this episode. When they first meet Momo, the flying lemur, who will be another one of their traveling companions from this point forward, because of his big ears and his elongated shadow, they think he's a Fire Nation soldier because his ears kind of make his head look like a Fire Nation Navy helmet or whatever. And granted, this is before we got the Gyatso scene, right? Yeah, it would have had to be. Granted, this is before we saw Monk Gyatso surrounded by... We saw his body surrounded by Fire Nation soldier bodies, which is super dark for a kid's show, too. Like, I haven't mentioned that yet, but that's so dark for a kid's show, and yet they handle it so well, right? It's very well handled. This is before we see that, so things aren't as dark as they could be yet. But the prevailing theory as to why there are no airbenders here now, aside from Aang anyway, is literally the genocide of their entire race. And yet, they think it's funny to go from us thinking that Momo is a Fire Nation soldier that these kids might have to murder, who they probably think is there to murder them, to a funny scene with funny music. I don't find that funny. Like, there's such a thing as dark humor and mood whiplash. Those things can work very well, regardless of what kind of story you're trying to tell. But the mood here was just... the contrast between the two moods was too stark. I just kind of find it eye-rolling in how unfunny it actually is. And this isn't even the only example of a specific kind of humor that this show includes relatively often that I just don't like at all. But we'll talk about that when we talk about it. And it is worth noting that most of the humor lands in this show. And it's also worth noting that this is the episode where Sokka's sarcastic, sardonic side starts to shine through a little bit, which, if I'm recalling correctly, this could be incorrect, so don't quote me on it. I think that was actually the voice actor, like, played with his lines and ad-libbed a little bit to try to give the character some more personality, and it really works. Like, Sokka's involvement in this episode is kind of basic. He doesn't really do much. Katara is a much more important character here. She's probably the most important character in this episode, besides Zuko or Aang and arguably Zhao. But I still find him more enjoyable here than I did in either of the two previous episodes. That said, while this episode does have problems, it's still very, very good. Like, it's not a masterpiece or anything. There are definitely better episodes of this show than this one, but this is still a fantastic episode, and I understand why a lot of people consider it to be their favorite, because even the slightly subpar episodes of Avatar are still really stinking good by regular animation standards. But as per usual, guys, I'd like to know, what do you think of the Southern Air Temple, the third episode of Avatar: The Last Airbender? If you have seen it, let's get a discussion going in the comment section down below, or over on my Discord, link in the description. But either way, this has been AJ22, and I will talk to you guys later.